So welcome all to the Hot Politics Lab meeting. Beth couldn't make it today, so I will be your co-host, Matthijs Roduin. And we have a special day today. It's Friday, so it's Graduate Friday. And we will have two presentations. The first one will be by Isabella Rebasso from the University of Amsterdam. And she will talk about political sophistication and the appraisal of politics. And the second presentation will be by Lennart Schürmann. And he will talk about emotional reactions of parties to political protest. And he is from the University of Cologne and is now staying in the Hot Politics Lab. Every talk will be about 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. And for people who are new, during or directly after the presentation, you can ask your questions or post your comments below in the Q&A box, so not in the chat box. And when you're sitting in the room with Gijs, you can just yell at him. But let's start with the first presentation by Isabella Rebasso. She's a PhD candidate here at the University of Amsterdam in the Hot Politics Lab. She got a BA from the University of Vienna and then did a research master in social sciences here in Amsterdam. And in her research, she focuses on how emotions and personality affect attitudes and political behavior. And now she will focus, if I'm correct, about on anger, fear, and political sophistication. Isabella, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matthijs. Wait.
Don't unmute yourself.
Okay.
I already muted you. It's fine.
Okay. Perfect. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry, this is weird because I just heard myself. Yeah, I'll be talking about political sophistication and the appraisal of politics. That's part of my dissertation, which focuses on when political communication elicits different emotions and amongst whom. And I'll skip kind of a long introduction about emotions in politics, it might matter. But I just want to say basically, while in the beginning of or a few decades ago, there was this understanding that it was more the unsophisticated who relied on emotions as like easy heuristics. In the past, about 15 years, I think we have come to understand that it's more the politically sophisticated who care more about emotions and who are more emotional about politics. And there's some findings also that show this. So some papers have shown that political sophisticates in general are more emotional about politics. There's also some that have found that it's the unsophisticated who are more affected. So that's when emotions are manipulated. But there's also work that has shown that it's the sophisticated who are more affected. And there's work that shows that it actually depends on the emotion or on the message source. And in all of this work, there's plenty of mixed findings that sophistication doesn't matter that much, or it only matters for some issues or some emotions. So there's definitely room to look into this more. And because I focus on cognitive appraisals, I will look specifically about how cognitive appraisals of politics influence the link between political sophistication and emotions. So first, what is political sophistication? There is some conceptual ambiguity about this term, and also in the measurement, which is something that I'm not going to focus on that much. But basically, it encompasses things like awareness, knowledge, engagement, interest, attention, and also effective ties to politics. And originally, or one of a common kind of conceptualization of political sophistication is that of political belief systems. So it basically means that political sophistication are different considerations that are linked together through cognitive ties. They're stored in long-term memory, and people differ in terms of the number of considerations, the range, so kind of like about how many different things do I have, attitudes or feelings, and how well they're connected. So so that's kind of the complexity of this network. And also an important part, and probably the most important part for this work, is that it's also affective ties. So that could be something very simple, like and dislike of a political candidate or a policy, etc. Any political object, basically. And what I argue is that also part of this network are different appraisals, so evaluations that we make of politics. And so the first question is, are political sophisticates really more emotional about politics? So generally, because they think about politics more, they tend to care more about it. There's no causal relationship here, but they care more, they think about it, they spend more attention to it. Therefore, it also has a higher goal relevance, which is important first appraisal, so we first have to care about something, and also potentially personal relevance. And what Lodge and Tabor argue also is that they have stronger effective ties to political objects. And therefore, yeah, they just care more about politics. So that means in general, they might experience stronger emotions, but it also might mean that it's easier to elicit these emotions because we can only elicit kind of effective ties through framing or priming if they, to some extent, already exist. But there's also, like this link is also not that clear. So if we experimentally manipulate emotions, there's also this argument that in an experiment, political sophisticates pay more attention and are more interested in any political stimulus. So they might read it better and process it kind of more carefully. And others have made the argument that political sophisticates are better able to translate arousal or an affective state into distinct, discrete emotions. But the fact that they also have these stronger effective cognitive structures, which is how Nabi calls it, means they're more, means that these structures are probably harder to manipulate. Political sophisticates are also more likely to be pre-treated because they have been exposed to politics more. And generally in framing, we can assume that people with strong predispositions who have been exposed to frames and different frames more are harder to manipulate. So that means that while it might be easier to elicit emotions, for example, if we ask people to think about something that makes them angry or fearful about politics, it might also be harder to manipulate discrete emotions, which kind of entails manipulating also an evaluation of political issues. And if we view emotion framing or the appraisal of emotions as a way of political learning, then we might, based on kind of the Suller argument of political learning, we might expect that it's actually the modestly sophisticated who are most likely to manipulate it. Why? To be manipulated. Why? Because the people are very low in sophistication, they don't care about it enough. And they don't kind of have these networks where they can integrate new information easily. But then the people who are very high in political sophistication, the network structure is just too strong to manipulate anything. And then the last question is, what's the role of appraisals? As I've already said, I assume that these appraisals are part of the effective cognitive structures, and they are probably harder to manipulate among sophisticates. And the question I also ask in this work is whether self-reported appraisals are more consistent with self-reported emotions among sophisticates than non-sophisticated. So basically whether these structures are more consistent when people have higher levels of sophistication. The data for this comes from 3 studies that I've already conducted, where in each one I measured political sophistication and self-reported interest, which I use as together as an index for sophistication. And in each experiment, I had 5 issues where I manipulated the appraisals. So the appraisals that are relevant for anger and anxiety, so certainty, control, and responsibility. And then I measured emotional responses. And what I also did in the second and third study is afterwards, I asked them to report themselves their appraisal. So how certain they feel about the consequences and how much they feel they have control over the issue. And I'll show these items later. So this is the data I'll be using. The N is 1,800 and then 2,400 for the other 2 studies combined. I measured the self-reported appraisals with these items. So these were 7-point scales where people just agreed or disagreed. I understand the consequences of this issue is for certainty, and then whether people themselves have control and whether they feel like people like them have control over the issue for control. And for responsibility, I asked them, it is clear who is responsible for the issue. And then I had an open question where they could write who they personally think is responsible. And here, yeah, the N is 2,400, and taking out the people who kind of said something like no idea or I don't know, I think I have about 1,000 good responses where people named an actual political actor. And for these questions, I would hand code them and to see if they named an actor and if it's the same actor as in the treatment. So if it's basically if it's an effect of the manipulation, or if it's something that they had already thought about, or something that they think regardless of the manipulation. Okay, what are my expectations? So first, I expect that political sophisticates report higher levels of emotions across issues and experimental condition. So this is obviously controlling for what I manipulated. And the dependent variables are anger, anxiety, and the main independent variable, political sophistication. And then in hypothesis 2, I expect that these effects are stronger for the moderately or modestly sophisticated and non-sophisticated and highly sophisticated. And this I will test with a simple interaction with responsibility and certainty, because these are the appraisals where I found a main effect in these past studies of the appraisals. For control, I didn't find an effect, so I don't really expect an interaction with sophistication. And then various controls. And for the self-reported appraisals, I should say this is not a causal model because they just reported an emotion and then I just asked them about these questions and I didn't manipulate anything. But I expect that people who report higher levels of anger also report higher levels of certainty, control, and responsibility. And the reverse for anxiety. And then I expect that these relationships are stronger for people with high levels of sophistication than people with low levels of sophistication. And here I will use sophistication as a continuous variable, whereas in the other ones, I will use it as a categorical variable with 3 levels, so low, moderate, and high. And then about the responsibility appraisal specifically for the open question, I expect that in general, sophisticates are more likely to name a responsible actor, and that they're more likely to name a responsible actor that is that differs from the one of the treatment. So this would be an indication that they have already thought about it. So if the treatment is not successful,
okay, I'm gonna unmute myself here because Gijs's computer crashed. Everyone still there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Still works.
Okay. Wait, let me. Okay, so right, so this would be an indication that it was any manipulation that is not successful for responsibility among the sophisticates is perhaps because they already have a responsible actor in mind. Oh. Okay, right, yeah. And this is the full conceptual model. So we have on the one side, the part that is experimental, where I look at the interaction of political sophistication with the manipulations. And then on the right side, we have the part that is observational. You all can see it. Maybe you can turn it around. Okay. Okay, so on the right side, we have the part that is observational. So this is firstly, the relationship between people's self-reported appraisals and the emotion, and then the interaction with sophistication. And this will be pre-registered soon, very soon. So now's a good time for any comments. And I should also say that I obviously have some knowledge of the data already because sophistication was a control in the other variables. So I know some of the basic descriptives of sophistication, and I also know that hypothesis 1 will be partly confirmed because I know that sophisticates, when controlling for the manipulations and the issues, on average report higher anger and anxiety, but this is not on all issues, but mostly in the pool samples, for sure. Right, and that's it. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. And I think
thank you, Isabella. Thanks. While Gijs is trying to get his computer working again, we will start with the Q&A. So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Christian.
Just a clarification question. Can you go back to that hypothesis where I think it was H5 or something, where you said you expected sophisticates are more likely to report a different actor than the one in the treatment? I didn't get to read the rationale behind that thought. Was it because they already know something about the issue, or?
Sorry, Christian, can we?
No, I cannot hear you if you don't have your sound. Yeah, H5B was it?
Okay, sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Christian?
Yeah, can you explain again why you expect H5B? I didn't get the reasoning behind it. Is it because you expect sophisticates to already know more about the topic, or?
Yes. Well, know more, but also kind of make these links, right? Like be quicker to come up with an actor who might be responsible, even if it's the government. So I think in none of the treatments, we just blamed the government because we didn't want them to be clearly partisan, but I expect them to be more likely to say whatever we said. So we might say, you know, it's everybody's fault, or it's farmers. We have this one thing about pollution with pesticides. So we might say it's farmers, but then they might actually say, no, it's the government that hasn't made any rules.
I also have a question. Or in the beginning, you argued that the literature is pretty well, that it's all over there, right? So that you have different predictions when it comes to these questions, when it comes to political sophistication. But in the end, you chose for strongly directional hypotheses. So you do have strong expectations. My question is basically, what made you decide to go for these specific ones and not for expectations the other way around? Because you argued that also in the literature you could come up with arguments the other way around. So what made you decide to go for these hypotheses?
Yeah, so I think for the general effect that sophisticates are more emotional, I think this one is probably the least debated. I think people mostly agree that on average, regardless of any manipulation, people who are sophisticated care more about politics. They're going to report higher emotions. But then when it comes to whether we can manipulate it, basically the argument I'm making is that if we manipulate, or if we just ask people to think about something that makes them scared, or if we don't try to manipulate any kind of cognitive evaluations, then I think the manipulation of emotions might be very successful amongst sophisticated compared to non-sophisticated people. But if we also try to manipulate kind of the evaluations of politics, then that's going to be harder. And that's what I'm doing here, right? So I can't really say anything about kind of emotional elicitation that is vague and doesn't manipulate any evaluation. So for example, if I ask people, think about something that has made you angry recently, I would expect that that's more successful amongst political sophisticates who are going to have such a consideration more easily accessible. Yeah. So in the end, also the conclusion of the literature is it might very much depend on how you want to elicit emotions.
Yeah.
And then in this specific case, obviously I've already collected the data, so it would be nice to show that it depends much on how you elicit it, but yeah, the data is already there.
Yeah, thanks. There's a question from Wouter Schakel. Hi, Isabella, nice to hear about your research. Do you have adequate statistical power to detect all your interaction effects? And if not, how do you plan to deal with this?
Yes, so I've in the past weeks done the power analysis, which, yeah, Christian is nodding because it's been a bit frustrating. So yes, so I do have power to detect one interaction, or to detect the interaction between the manipulations and responsibility and the manipulations of certainty. And because they are independent of each other, because they're manipulated. I can also put them in one model. That should be fine. And then for the appraisal, the self-reported appraisals, I have about, because I only asked this in the last round, so I have about 2,400, or I have exactly 2,400 observations, and I think I should have. So there, I haven't done the power analysis yet, but I think I should have enough power, maybe not to do all interactions at the same time. Yeah, that would be yeah, I need to do a power analysis for that part, like the observational part, and see if that actually works. Yeah, so that I don't know. I would have to look into that more. So one part I know, and that's the experimental part, which was the one I was more concerned about. Now I'm thinking I should be concerned about the other one too. Yeah, so back to power analysis, I guess. Thanks, Walter.
There's a question by Tobias Robach. This looks like a super interesting project. You said you have knowledge of the distribution of political sophistication in your data. Is there a lot of variance? And do you know whether sophisticates are demographically different from people with low sophistication?
Oh, that I haven't looked at, the relationship to other kind of demographic variables. I mean, there's some work that kind of equates political sophistication and education, so perhaps they're related. I haven't looked into it. It's kind of normally distributed. So yeah, there's quite some variation in political sophistication. I had 4 questions. Some definitely were quite difficult and almost nobody got them right. And then some, almost everybody got right. And overall, yeah, I think, yeah, I'm not very concerned. I don't know it right now off the top of my head, but yeah.
Guys, there are some questions in the room over there, right?
Oh, should I mute again? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm back again. I had a question, particularly how you are going to adjudicate between hypothesis 1 and 2, because there might be a possibility that there is a positive linear effect, that both are true. There is a positive linear effect because medium is higher than low, and that there are not so many people at the end, so that you find evidence for both hypotheses. How are you going to then judge which one of those?
Sorry, hypothesis 1, I can't switch back. Hypothesis 1 is the direct effect. Yeah, and the hypothesis 2 is the categorical effect. Sophistication is a categorical effect, where low and high are supposed to score lower than medium. Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm so distracted by it now. How are you going to judge between 1 and 2? What 1 can be true and 2 can be true? Yeah, I think they can both be true, no? Yeah. Yeah, because 1 is about the manipulation and whether it's successful, and the first one is just on average, do they report more higher sophistication? So does it doesn't have to be one of the two, no? No, but I think it would be good to say, it would be good in the end to be able to say it's a linear effect, or it's more categories that matter here. Right. And so I think it would be good to have a decision rule in case both are statistically significant, where you're going to say it's this one or the other one. For hypothesis 2, I mean. For to decide between the two. The hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2? Yeah. Why do I have to decide between the two? One can be just that political sophisticates on average report higher emotions, and the other one would be that amongst the modestly sophisticated, the emotional manipulation is the strongest, right? Mm-hmm. But why do I have to decide which one is true? Because this is a debate in the literature, right? Whether it's a linear effect or a categorical effect. The manipulation.
Okay.
Because the one is controlling for the manipulations and the other one is the interaction with the experimental manipulation.
Okay, but then I'm a little confused because why do you expect something different than from sophisticates without them being treated and with them being treated?
Could you maybe show the hypotheses, Isabella?
Yeah, my screen is stuck.
Okay, never mind.
We have a room full of failing computers.
It's time. Let's see.
I just think this. Okay, so now I thought they were exactly the same, but then just the IG is different. But I see they're different now. But why would you expect for H1 a linear effect and for H2 a non-linear effect?
Because I would expect that the more highly sophisticated you are, the more you care about politics. So this is controlling for the manipulation. So just on average, people who are highly sophisticated feel the strongest about politics. But that also means that those that feel very strongly about politics already are probably the hardest to manipulate.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Are there more questions there, Gijs?
I don't know. No, but I also think it's time to go to Lennart's.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Isabella. Let's hand over the floor to Lennart, but let me first say a few words about Lennart. He's a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Cologne, and he obtained his master's from the Goethe University of Frankfurt, and he's interested in the political representation of protest in Europe and quantitative text analysis techniques. And he's now with us at the Hot Politics Lab for a research stay. And here he mainly focuses on the measurement of emotional appeals by political elites in the context of protest events. Lennart, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Matthias, for the introduction, and special thanks also to Pais for inviting me here. Yeah, I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Cologne, and as you said before, my PhD project is the political representation of protest in European democracies. And the paper that I'm presenting today is the third paper of my dissertation, and it's in a very early stage, so it's more research design, can be a pre-analysis plan soon. So therefore, all comments and all suggestions are more than welcome, and I'm very happy to hear your feedback. But let's start. So the working title of this paper is, Do You Need to Be Violent to Be Heard? Responsiveness and Emotional Reactions of Western European Parties to Political Protest. And so what's the paper about? I'm interested here in the reactions of parties and politicians to protest events. And I know the Netherlands are usually a rather protest-averse country, at least compared to Spain and France. But with the pandemic, this changed. And here on this photo, you can see a protest event in Eindhoven. You can see several protesters. Some people would say they are rioters. And this was at the beginning of the year. And the people here were protesting against the curfew and other measurements that were decided by the government to fight the COVID pandemic. And on the right side, you can see Mark Rutte. He's the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And he and also several other politicians referred to this protest, usually in a rather negative way. And in short, he condemned the protests as riots and said these protesters are criminals. And furthermore, he also famously stated that he was not interested in hearing the sociological explanations for these protests. And yeah, well, whatever, I'm not here to make judgments about the protests or about the reactions. I'm here to analyze them. And some questions here arise. For example, would Rutte have referred or cared about these protests if they hadn't been violent? And would, for example, a left-wing prime minister have reacted differently? Of course, these questions are all rather counterfactual, but I'm interested in the general pattern here, and this is what I want to analyze in this paper. So my main, or my two research questions here are, when do parties respond to political protest, and which factors determine the emotional reactions of parties to these protests? So I'm interested in two things. At first, the responsiveness of parties, and then the emotional reactions. Yeah, but of course, the first thing is, or the question arises, why is this important to study, and what do we know already? Well, we know that social movements signal the political opinion of parts of the populations, but social movements or protesting social movements are not the ones who decide on policies. Ultimately, these are politicians. So protesting social movements are rather beggars at the policy gates. But what we know from research is that protest can shape the opinion of political representatives, and who responds to protest depends on ideology and strategic considerations. I will skip the entire theoretical frame here and go straight into the hypothesis. And the first set of hypotheses here is party related. And in the literature, it's often assumed that opposition parties have a closer connection to protest because protests are usually against governmental decisions. So I expect first that opposition parties respond to protest more frequently than government parties. Also, the literature assumes that left-wing parties are some sort of institutional allies of social movements. So I expect left-wing parties to respond more frequently to protest, more often than right-wing parties. And a similar rationale is behind my third hypothesis here, that populist parties respond more frequently to protest than non-populist parties. This is because populists always stress that they represent the will of the people. They're interested in what the real people think. And so populists have a certain connection. Furthermore, I'm not only interested in the party drivers here, but also in the protest as such. So I expect that after large protest events, parties generally refer more often to protest. And here the emotional aspect comes into play. My second protest size related hypothesis is that after large protest events occur in a country, parties generally talk more positively about protest in parliament. This, however, is totally different if we look at violent protests. Here I also expect, and I think Mark Rutte was a very good example for that, that violent protest events lead to more responsiveness. So I expect that after violent protest events occur in the countries, parties generally refer more frequently to protest. However, if they do it in a more negative way. So in contrast to the large protest events, violent protests are rather discussed more negatively in parliament. And last but not least, I've got a fourth set of hypotheses related to issue ownership. And I expect that parties are more likely to respond to protests in line with issues they own than other parties. For example, that would be that Green parties refer more often to environmentalist protests, and also that they talk more positively about protests that are in line with their own issues. So in sum, I wanted to do I've got two main interests here. Like I said before, the responsiveness of parties to protest and the emotional reactions. And here I have two sub-analyses. First, the responsiveness of parties to protest in general, and then to protest about specific policy issues. And the same goes for emotional reactions. The data that I'm going to use is the PAL speech data set. I've got a translated version of the PAL speech data set, so all speeches are English here. This will, so I will use the PAL speech data set here, and the PALGov data set for governmental data, so opposition, prime minister, whatever. and the Chapel Hill Expert Survey for party data, so left-right positioning of parties. Furthermore, I'm using the POLDEM dataset for protest data. POLDEM is an ERC advanced grant project led by Conceptual Model, and they collected protest data for all European countries. And here on the map, you can see the countries that I will analyze. So far, I've got 4 Western European countries, namely Austria, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. And I'm thinking about adding Spain and Great Britain as well, but I haven't got the data yet, and I would have to work on that a little bit more. In total, I've got data from 2010 till 2015, so 6 years, and I'm analyzing 38 parliamentary groups. So far, so good, but I've got several bigger issues here. The first one is, how can I identify the protest passages in the parliamentary speeches? And I decided to follow a 3-step identification strategy here. I start with a dictionary, and here I've got 2 different types of dictionaries. One is an already established one by the POLDEM project. This is a dictionary that includes terms like protest, strike, riot, so all these protest-related terms. However, if I only use that, I miss all these indirect mentions of protests. Like, for example, if people talk about Black Lives Matter or important actors. So I decided that I will create a second dictionary with these social movement terms, so with specific social movements. And to do that, I will use named entity recognition and word embeddings. But I haven't done that yet. This is a task for next week or someday in the future. And the dictionaries that I use are rather greedy. So I've got several false positives. And I thought a lot about it. And at the end, I decided to go with human coding, manual validation. So I think I have only a few false negatives, but I've got a large sum of false positives. And with human coding, manual validation, checking all entries, I can decide, or I can these false positives. And last but not least, I will run a topic modeling to get the policy issues. So this was the identification, and at the end, I will have here. This is all about measuring responsiveness, then how will I model this responsiveness? What I will have at the end are counts here, and these are subject to over-dispersion. So I will use a negative binomial distribution, and my data will be aggregated on the party and date level. So I've got for all parties several observations, which then again are embedded in countries. So I'm using, or to account for these, multi-level model, or I will use mixed effect models. I'm mainly interested in the effects of opposition, left, right, people versus elite. This is my proxy for populism. We can talk about whether this is a good proxy or not later. Then I will use the number of protest participants in the previous 3 months relative to the population, so to account that some countries are bigger or smaller, and whether violent protest events occurred in the previous 3 months in the country. And last but not least, for these policy-specific analysis, I will also have an additional independent variable that is issue owner. So I've got several controls, but I think they're not important here. So now we come to the more tricky part, I would say. I also want to model the emotional reactions. And I'm sorry for throwing these equations at you here, but they're relatively easy if you, or they're also quite common. The first one is the general sentiment score, was introduced by Lowe et al. In 2011. And here just the number of positive terms plus 0.5 is divided by the number of negative terms. And this then locked, then you get sentiment score here. But this is a rather well-known procedure to calculate sentiment. More interesting is the second equation here, which I will use for my topic-specific emotions. And here I'm using adjusted equation or formula by Daniele Saldivia Gonzatti. He introduced it this year, and he connects sentiment scores with topic modeling in a very nice way, and it works quite well for my case as well. Here you use the topic prevalences to see or to adjust for the fact that some passages are more, or some identified passages here are more part of one topic than another one. So at the end, I will get here a sentiment score for a party per day per topic. And this will be modeled with the linear mixed effect model. So, yeah, this was my research plan so far. And I decided to already take a look at a subset of the data to see whether my topic modeling algorithms run like I want them to. And I've prepared some visualizations here, but I think I'm close to 15 minutes, therefore I will just briefly go through that. So these are just, this is just a first look at the data from Germany. It's not a fancy visualization of the results. I haven't calculated anything yet here. But here you can see that if the number of protest participants in the previous 3 months is higher, the frequency that people in parliament talk about protests is also higher. Here I assumed a linear effect. So here we can see first insights into the data. I also calculated the mean sentiment, and here on the x-axis you can see the number of violent protest events in the previous 3 months, and this is kind of interesting, at least I think so, that the more violent protest events occurred in the previous 3 months, the more negative the mean sentiment in these protest-related passages is. So here we see some first, some first insights into the data, but I haven't done the calculations yet, so this is not like a real finding. This is what I want to work on during my research stay here, and since I've got no results, I haven't got a conclusion slide, but instead I've got several questions that I want to ask you. And the first one is what you think about the sentiment analysis, whether a simple sentiment analysis is sufficient to measure emotional reactions in political speeches, or what you think. I mean, you all here at the Politics Lab are experts on emotions and politics. What do you think are suitable alternatives? How can I measure emotions in political text differently? And what do you think about the hypotheses? Do I have too many of them, and or should I reduce them? Is it enough for one paper, or maybe too much? And last but not least, I talked to several people about pre-registering, and we already heard about it today. And do you think I can still, even though I already looked at the German subset of the data, can I still pre-register my research design? And do you think I should do that? Is that necessary here? So these are just 3 open questions. You can, of course, also refer to all other things. And yeah, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hear your feedback.
Thanks a lot, Lennart. It's great to hear what you were working on. I already have a question from Conrad from the University of Warsaw. Hi, Lennart. You cover a lot of interesting issues. Looking forward to the results. Can you explain how do you define responsiveness of the politicians? Would Rutte's comment be counted as a response?
I would definitely say that it's a response. Yeah, I wasn't sure about whether I should call it responsiveness or rather issue attention, because what I measure here is more issue attention. So responsiveness for me would be if a protest heard whether a politician reacted to that. It's difficult with my research design maybe to measure exactly responsiveness. Yeah, I will think about that. It's a good comment. I also thought about it. Maybe I should go more for the term issue attention. But since I've got these, I've got the time dimension, I thought I can really see an effect here. So if a protest occurs, then a politician reacts to it. But I will think about it.
Next question is from Magda.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I really like the idea. I had a similar question about what the responsiveness means for you. I do think that you can basically say responsiveness can have many dimensions, and you focus basically on like a symbolic attention to it. But I think I would also like to hear more about whether that means then like a success for the movement, or whether it can also like dismiss them a bit. Yeah, so also what the positive and negative means for that. And the second question was whether you also distinguish between the ideological leaning of the social movement, because also within the issue that can, of course, differ.
Yeah, these are two great questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, I would say at first it's a success if politicians pick up or refer to a protest, because this is what protest and social movements want. They want usually a change in policies, and to get the attention of politicians is the first step to this, I would say. Whether then the reaction is positive or negative, this is debatable. So my initial idea was to say that violent protests maybe get the attention, but then politicians would say, yeah, okay, no, we don't want to deal with these people. And this is exactly what happened here in the Dutch case, I would say. But yeah, and with regard to the ideology, yeah, I'm trying, or the data that I have, the PODEM data also has the issues. And there are, for example, the issue xenophobic protest or environmentalism protest. And with this, I have, I would say, yeah, a little bit the ideology. Yeah. So that would be included.
Okay, there's a question from Christian.
Thanks, Lennart, for your presentation. What I first wanted to say is that I think when I'm back in Amsterdam again, we should sit down again and talk about topic-specific sentiment and how to measure that probably. My question is mainly about, I know you said you cut all the theory out, but what is kind of the mechanism that you use to explain, that you think about when politicians pick up protest events and talk about them in parliament? I'm specifically thinking about like also smaller protest events, and then contrasting that with the sometimes slow agenda of parliamentary debates, and that they're tied to parliamentary calendar and to the legislative agendas that are there. So like, how do you expect that these things are translated into parliament? And if not, and if maybe some more direct communication of politicians, like press releases or other forms of communication that actually are intended or are more natural to react to everyday events, if they're not a more fruitful way of, where we would actually expect more?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I think most parliaments have these, in Germany or in Austria, it's called Aktuelle Stunde, these current hour where you can debate pressing topics that happened during the last weeks. And I think this is exactly where huge protest movements would come up. At least this is what happened. Here I studied the German case more in detail, and this happened in the German case quite often, that protests were discussed during these Aktuelle Stunde format. But for the other countries, I will look into that again. Also, this is the reason why I decided to have the 3 previous months, because it takes, of course, a long time for protests to make it into parliamentary debates. It takes time to prepare all the documents in the parliament. And so I decided if I have a 3-month window, then there is enough time. And I also there follow the paper by Hutter and Fliegenthal they also have a similar approach there. They also decided to go for a 3-month period to take into account this rather long process of protests, making it into parliamentary debates or into parliamentary discussions in what type of.
Yeah, but it strikes me that you maybe want to count protests differently then. So I'd say there's sort of a cumulative effect of protests if the same protest is happening over and over again. Right? That's going to be different than a uniquely new protest. So the Corona protests, the fact that they took place every Sunday, destroying Museum Square here, week after week, that had a much stronger effect than just the additive logic of each individual. And that's something I think you could explicitly model. Yeah. And then you could also make a distinction between, say, quick responses just for TV, which you would find during the prime ministerial question hour, where you were a British variant of what you were just referring to regarding Germany. Yeah, I mean, all countries have that. But so you then should look at a subset of data. But so of course, it's likely that you would respond there to a single protest event, but it's quite unlikely that a single protest event would really have an effect 3 months after, unless it was really something extreme, an extreme event. That introduces the problem that if it's really an extreme event, it's actually going to be quite hard to model that in a meaningful way. Did I have one more comment? I'm just going to leave it there. Maybe you want to respond.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Actually, this was my initial idea, to start from the protest event and then go into the parliamentary speeches and see whether this particular event was taken up and if it's special in terms of participation numbers or special in terms of extreme violence or special in terms of, I don't know, every week events or something. Like in most countries, these Fridays for Future events took place, not so much in the Netherlands, I think, but they have these every Friday protesting, and this really made, this had an effect on parliamentary debates in most countries. So to group that somehow together or to model it, but yeah, I will look into the data again and see whether I can somehow count for that. But this is very good.
I remember the other point I wanted to make is that you want to look into how these things co-evolve. I mean, now you treat them as two independent events, but what happens in Parliament is also going to affect what happens on the street, especially if we talk about these continuing events. If there is, for example, a political party that is very positive about these protest movements, this is definitely going to fuel the protest movement more. Or reversely, if the government really talks a lot about it and is really extremely negative about it, then this is also likely to only increase the size of the protest and maybe the aggression of the protest.
Yeah, that's probably true. Still, I think the inverse relation is stronger or more important. At least this is what I want to focus on here, but I will definitely think about that again, how parliamentary speeches or the activities of politicians affect the protest behavior of the people.
Okay. Yeah, I just have a small question. I want to ask the statistical power question. Did you do a power analysis?
No, not so far. I'm still at the beginning.
Yeah, but how big are those data sets? Like how many data speeches are in there?
So I've got several thousands of speeches, but at the end I group them on a daily level. So I've got one per party per day. I've got one number, but yeah, this is true
Yeah.
The specific challenge of a power analysis there is that you're dealing still with rare event data, that there are going to be a massive amount of zeros. So it may look like you have a lot of data, but since the distribution is so extreme, it actually might become problematic. Okay, we're at the end, right, Matthijs?
Yes, I think so.
A few more questions, by the way, Christian, and you yourself, Matthijs, have questions. So I just suggest you email them to.
Yeah, we'll do that later. Thanks, guys. And thanks, of course, Isabella and Lennart. Very interesting presentations. And thank you, all the people there in the on-site, in the common room for participating, and people also online for participating. We will have a new meeting of the Hot Politics Lab next week, October 29th. And Alan Sanfi from the Radboud University in Nijmegen will talk about social motivations in choice, insights from decision neuroscience. And 1 week later, we will have Giselinde Kuipers from the KU Leuven, and she will talk about humor and polarization, how humor can drive people apart in politics and beyond. November 12th, we will have Hannah Nam from Stony Brook University. November 19, Jamie Saddle from the College of William and Mary. November 26, Christian Pipal and Matthijs Gillissen from the Hot Politics Lab, one from University of Amsterdam, the other from Radboud University. And then 3 more meetings. December 3, Leonie Huddy from Stony Brook. December 10, Frederick Hopp from Communication Science at the University of Amsterdam. And January 14, Marthe Otten from the Department of Psychology at the University of Amsterdam. That's it. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you all next week.